All right, hello everyone. It's great to welcome you back to another IAIFI Colloquium. It's a pleasure to have Demba give today's colloquium. Demba is an associate professor of electrical engineering and bioengineering at Harvard University School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, where he directs the CRISP group. Recently, he has taken a keen interest in the connection between artificial neural networks and sparse signal processing. His group leverages this connection to solve data-driven, unsupervised learning problems in neuroscience, to understand the principles of hierarchical representations of sensory signals in the brain, and to develop explainable AI. In 2016, he received a research fellowship in neuroscience from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. With that introduction, please join me in welcoming Professor Ba. There will be a question and answer session at the end, during which you may ask questions in real time. Alternatively, feel free to submit questions at any point during the talk into the chat to be answered during the Q&A at the end. Thanks a lot. And with that, Demba, we look forward to your colloquium. Thanks.
Thank you for the great introduction, Jim. It's great to be here. What I want to talk to you about today is a prescription for how one designs artificial intelligence or neural network for solving scientific problems in a principled fashion. I will use neuroscience as an example. When appropriate, I will make connections to physics and problems that people in IAIFI are interested in, and other disciplines, it turns out, such as biology. And a colleague at MIT, I borrow this term from him, has coined this approach, substantive intelligence. So I have interests in two classes of problems. The first one is shown here on the left side. The second one will pop up soon on the right side, and I will try to convince you that these are very connected in an interesting fashion. The first class of problems are unsupervised learning problems in neuroscience to help decipher the neural code. Two examples of these are on the slide on the left side. The first example is what I call source separation problems, which abound in neuroscience. And as I will try to convince you, abound in similar guises in a lot of disciplines of science, in physics, biology, among other fields. So what does this mean? What is the source separation problem? So the holy grail in neuroscience is to record from every neuron in the brain. We do not know how to do that yet. So what neuroscientists do is they stick electrodes in the brain. These electrodes record signals such as the green trace that you're looking at here. There are deflections here which correspond to neural activity from different neurons. So the electrode is listening to neurons that are close by. One of the most fundamental problems is to take the data of the electrode and identify the neural sources that are present. We call this a source separation or deconvolution problem in signal processing. In this example that we'll go through in detail, there are two sources that are present, a blue one and a yellow one. Another interesting problem that neuroscientists are fascinated about, and that I'm fascinated about as well, is to understand how the brain processes information hierarchically. This idea of hierarchical representation and hierarchical processing of information, I will try to convince you as well, occurs not only within neuroscience, but in a lot of disciplines in science. So this is the first class of problems. How do you develop unsupervised learning algorithms to figure out the principles of neural computation? Another class of problems that I've been fascinated by is how do you design interpretable deep neural networks? We're all excited about deep learning. It's the craze of the past 10 years or so, right? But at present, I do not think that we have strong prescriptions for how one actually goes about designing them in a principled fashion. And it's a problem that I've been fascinated with from a mathematical perspective. How do these two seemingly disparate types of problems connect with each other? And this is going to be the main thread of my talk. I believe they connect to this idea that I call sparse coding or deep sparse coding. And this slide is meant to give you an overall sense of where the talk is going to go. We're going to go through all of this in detail during the talk, but at a very basic level, let's consider this source separation problem here. I'm going to treat the green trace as a signal Y. We're going to posit a model for this signal. That's a reasonable one that says that, hey, you stick an electrode in the brain, it's primarily going to listen to a small number of neurons that surround that electrode, and that the recording of the electrode is going to be a superposition of the sources that are neighboring it, this blue one and this yellow one, and that these sources are going to occur sparsely in time. Probabilistically, we think about this as a model of y, the signal, given sources h and vectors x, which we're going to treat as sparse vectors that are going to tell you when a given source is active at the electrode and with what amplitude. Okay? It turns out that solving this source separation problem is equivalent to learning from the data y, the sources, and when they occur, and that we can map this problem one-to-one, and I will show you this, into a neural network architecture for solving the source separation problem. The important things for you to pay attention at this point is that the data comes into this architecture and that all components of the architecture are directly derived from the statistical model we have of the data. The weights, which represent the sources, come from the model. The nonlinearity here, which is a value I will show you, comes from this assumption of sparsity. Okay? Now, this sparse coding model, there's only one set of weights here. When we're talking about hierarchical processing or hierarchical representation, it makes sense that we would have representations that involve multiple sets of weights. So I've come up with a generalization of this sparse coding model that I call the deep sparse coding model. So this model says the following. It is motivated by a model we believe that the brain has of the world out there. So the brain sees, the visual system in particular sees images, and it hierarchically represents them using neurons into features that it can use to classify them into different categories. I've come up with a model that says that the brain, for an image Y, the brain starts with a very high level concept of that image that you can think as a sparse concept. It cascades that to a hierarchy of transformation that give you progressively more refined representations until an image pops out of this. Now, it turns out that the problem of learning this model that the brain may use, using a data set of natural images, again, you can cast one-to-one into the problem of training this autoencoder neural network architecture, whose components all come from the generative model. And the idea here, and this is an idea that has become very popular in neuroscience, is that if the brain has evolved to process natural signals of the world, let us leverage natural signals such as images to learn architectures that are going to allow us to probe the principles that the brain uses to process these natural signals. So you should think of these weight matrices from a neuroscience perspective as representing neural connectivity between layers in the brain. And you should think of the intermediate representations or the hidden layers of your neural networks as representing neural network activity. So we start with unsupervised learning problems. We can cast them one-to-one into neural network architectures that I call explainable or interpretable. So to me, what this points to is the idea that we have a unique opportunity, I believe, using these ideas from sparse coding to utilize deep learning in a principled fashion to solve scientific problems. All right, let's dive into the talk. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about was the first component of that slide, which is how do you design in a principled fashion interpretable neural networks for solving source separation problems? Before I can get there, I want to give you a one-slide primer of how we actually acquire neural activity. And again, I want to primarily use neuroscience as an example of principles that I think, or ideas that I think are pervasive in science, in physics, in biology, and in other disciplines. So how do we record from the brain? So if you went back about 20 years ago, 25 or so years ago, one of the most popular recording techniques utilized what are called tetrodes. This is an array of 4 electrodes that you insert inside the brain. And these 4 electrodes are listening to the activity of neurons that are near them. So in this particular case, you have the 4 electrodes that are close to a red and a blue neurons. They're primarily seeing activity from those neurons. Now, about 20 or 25 years ago in neuroscience, we would roughly generate about a gigabyte of data every 6 hours. We've now moved to a new technology that I'm pretty excited about and that neuroscientists are excited about, multi-electrodes array, multi-dimensional electrodes array. The primary difference between the legacy technology and the new technology is that these electrodes now are 2-dimensional, which means that they record volumes over time. And the data rate of these electrodes has blown up to roughly 400 gigabytes every hour. Now, what is the goal? You insert the electrodes, they're listening to neighboring sources. We want to be able to identify the neural sources from the data, the electrodes. The source separation problem, in neuroscience, we refer to as spike sorting. So in the rest of the talk, every time I say spike sorting, you should think being able to identify neurons from electrical activity that is recorded from some sensors. All right, so in this first part of the talk, I'm going to begin here. I'm going to begin with data from a single electrode, and this is generalizable to data from multiple electrodes. So you see these deflections here, which represent spikes, events from neurons. Now, we do not know for each of these deflections which neurons produce them, and that is the problem that we're trying to solve. I'm going to come up with what I call the sparse coding model of this signal Y here, the data at the electrodes. The details I will go through in a second are not so important. What's important is that I can express this model in the form Y equals some matrix H times a vector X and noise, and that this vector X is going to be sparse. Where does this assumption of sparsity come from again? It comes from the fact that we're going to assume that neurons are polite. They're not all trying to talk at the same time. So at any given point in time here in this time series, only a few of the neurons are going to be active at the same time. We're going to take this in the next few slides. We're going to turn this. I'm going to give you a prescription for how to turn this in a principled fashion into what I call an explainable AI or an explainable neural network architecture. Again, explainable in the sense that every component of this architecture is directly derived from the statistical model you posited about the data from which you're trying to identify these sources, from which you're trying to identify these patterns. Why would you want to do this? In my own opinion, one reason why you'd want to do this is because you can leverage technology that companies such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, and all these tech companies have developed for deploying neural network architectures on massive data sets utilizing GPUs and these days things such as TPUs, tensor processing units. Now, following this, I will show you that the architecture indeed is going to solve my source separation problem. It's going to learn weights that corresponds to the sources that are present in your data. The hidden layers of the network are going to correspond to the times and the amplitudes of the events that arise from each of the sources. And coming out of the network, you're going to get separated channels for each of the sources. This is what we're going to go through in the next few slides. Okay, so where do we start? I have a signal processing background. Those of you that have a signal processing background will recognize this notation. Where I start here, let me assume that I have three sources, each with what I call an associated filter. So every source is going to be represented by a filter, which I indicate by the letter H. There's going to be three of them here. Little n here represents the discrete time index for the samples of this particular source. What else do we need? We need sparse codes. And in the next slide, I will show you that if you convolve H1 here with X1 of n here, which is a discrete time signal that is 0 everywhere except where you see a bar here. And without loss of generality, I've made these bars about the same height. They could be different heights. That's the detail again. If you convolve these two things, what's going to happen is that the filter or the source is going to be placed everywhere where one of these bars appeared, and is going to be scaled by the height of that particular bar. This is going to form the basis for this convolutional generative model of the data that is recorded at our electrodes. So I'm going to posit a model that's going to say that little y of n, this is a discrete time signal that represents the data that is recorded at my electrode, and there could be multiple such electrodes. For the sake of simplicity, we'll just focus on one of these. I'm going to posit that these data are the linear combination, and we could also make this nonlinear. So, but just to keep it as simple as possible, it's the linear combination of filter sources convolved with vectors that are sparse and that tell you the location and the amplitudes of events from any given source. So H1 of n convolved with H1 of n would correspond to this blue trace here. You take the source and you place it at the location of the events, and so on and so forth from the other sources. Now, combining these and adding noise, that gives me a generative model for my data. Okay, now, it is convenient for us to write this generative model in linear algebraic form. You can start from this model here, take the signal y of n, treat it as a vector y that lives in the same dimension as the number of samples you have in the signal, and express the relationship between the filters, the sparse vectors, and y in this following linear algebraic form. Okay, so this says that y equals hx times v. What is this matrix H here? This matrix H is a block matrix where each of the blocks corresponds to one of the sources in your data. Similarly, the vector x is a block vector, is that each of these matrices that comprise H, because of the convolution, they're going to be what are called in linear algebra toplets matrices. So you should think of H as all of the possible delays of these filters here. Okay? What is the problem that we're interested in doing? Or how do we solve this source separation problem? Given only the data y, we would like to solve for the matrix H, or for the sources that are associated with this matrix H, as well as for these vectors x, which are going to tell us when sources occur and with what amplitude. Now, lest you should think that this is a pretty limited formulation, I want to convince you in this particular slide that the formulation that I showed you in the previous one does not just apply to time series. It applies to signals of multiple dimensions. So in the case where my electrode array is two-dimensional, if my electrode array is two-dimensional, and let's say the first dimension I call K1, and the second dimension I call K2, I insert this in the brain, it's now seeing spatial signatures of neurons, 3 neurons in this particular case, or sources, but it's also recording data over time. So the data that you're recording from these multi-electrode array are now 3-dimensional volumes. Well, how does that change our model? The only way it changes our model is that now instead of having 1-dimensional convolutions, we have multi-dimensional convolutions. But because convolution is a linear operation, we can write this again as y equals hx plus v. So whenever I write this model here, you should not just be thinking of 1-dimensional signal. We're really talking about operations that can be vectorized or tensorized, and so on and so forth. I said at the beginning of the talk that I believe that this y equals hx model is pervasive in science, in physics, in biology, and the slide is meant to convey this. So in neuroscience, the vector y represents data from electrode arrays, h represents neurons, x represents event times of amplitudes. The model is a convolutional one. If I move to something like astrophysics, y could represent data from a telescope array. The h is because our sources could represent the signatures of celestial objects, and the x's here could represent their location and their intensity in the sky. Okay, that model again could be a convolutional model. So in particle physics, my terminology here may be off, but we can think of y as collider observables, and as the h's here as topics or patterns of collider observable that are being mixed in different proportions using this vector x. In this particular case, the matrix H is not a convolutional matrix, as far as I understand. In optics, again, y represent intensity. Optics actually is an interesting example of a model where it is not linear in the sense that there should be an absolute value here in front of the hx to capture intensity. This matrix H here, depending on the setting, one might or might not be able to model as a convolution. Typically, it's a scattering matrix. In genomics, y represents gene expression levels of a cell, and the columns of H here represent the gene expression modules that cells are combinations of which cells are taking to obtain their gene expression levels, and so on and so forth. I could go on and on and on here about how this particular model arises in different guises in different disciplines in science. So now let us go back to the problem of interest, which is just given the data that you've obtained from your scientific experiment, how do you learn the components of this model? And how do you learn this in a manner that utilizes AI and deep neural network, but where the components of the deep neural network are understandable to you? So I come from a signal processing background and an optimization background. So the first thing I would like you to allow me to do, and this is just for processing purposes, we don't need to do this. I'm just going to take the data and break it into different chunks. And each of those chunks I'm going to call Yj. Let's say there's J capital of them. What I would like to solve is what I call, because the model that I showed you earlier is convolutional, it doesn't have to be convolutional. I would like to solve a dictionary learning problem. I want to find the sources, these are my H's, as well as the times and amplitudes, the times which correspond to the location when those sources occur in the signal and their amplitudes that solve this following optimization problem. What does this optimization problem say? Let us forget about this sum here, because this is just for the different windows. It says that I would like my data to be well approximated by combinations of the sources and the location and amplitude of the events. Reasonable. I want my model to reconstruct my data well. The second component of this optimization is one that promotes sparsity in the times when the sources occur, and it also controls the level of their amplitudes. So this dictionary learning problem says learn sources and locations and amplitude for these sources such that the locations and the amplitudes are sparse, and such that you also minimize at the same time the reconstruction error of your signal, Y, utilizing combination of the sources and the vectors X. This constraint here is important, and this is actually something that at a high level, let me not go in too much of a digression. In deep learning, typically one does not put constraints on the weights of the network. It turns out that this is important for the identifiability of the model. Why? Because I could scale H by a constant, multiply X by the inverse of that constant, and I would still get the same model. So in dictionary learning, we typically have constraints that the energy of the sources is constrained within some bounds. And this lambda parameter here, which I will show you, is going to be related to the bias in the values of your neural network, is something that we can learn from data, and that is related to the amount of noise that you believe is present in the data. How do we do this? So we have a mathematical audience here. You look at this, the first thing that should come to your attention is that this is not a convex optimization problem. Why is it not convex? It's not convex because it involves the product of two of your optimization variables. So how we solve this in practice is by a procedure called alternating minimization. I'm going to start with a guess of the sources. I'm going to utilize that guess to solve for these sparse vectors. I'm going to get new sparse vectors, and then I'm going to go and refine my sources, and I'm going to do this backwards and forward. Okay, so the first component of this, when H is a convolution matrix, we call that convolutional sparse coding. So the convolutional sparse coding, it turns out, is separable over all of these J chunks that I have in my data. This problem asks to find the sparse vector xj that minimizes this L2 reconstruction loss with this penalty. Two things to note about this problem. It is embarrassingly parallelizable. This problem parallelizes over all of the J chunks of your windows. What this means is that I can take advantage of the parallelism that is offered by GPU technology, right? So I can process all of these J chunks of my data independently using GPUs, which means that any algorithm that I could come up with to solve this, I can readily make it parallelizable by leveraging GPU technology. The next thing I want to show you now is that this optimization problem has an intimate connection with ReLU networks. And after I show you that, I will show you that by changing this prior here, you can connect it to neural networks with different kinds of nonlinearities. Okay, but to show you that connection first, I'm going to simplify that problem and assume that Y is a scalar variable, there is no H, and that X is also a scalar variable. That's the next slide. So that sparse coding problem that I showed you in the earliest slide, in one dimension, it is akin to solving the optimization problem on this first line here, where I've constrained X to be non-negative here. So I want to find the X, there is no H again, just assume it's 1, that minimizes in one dimension the distance between X and Y is given to you, subject to this sparsity constraint in one dimension. Yeah, it turns out that the math of this is not too hard to do. It's not trivial, but it's not hard to do. It turns out that the solution to this is to take Y, shift it to the left by lambda, and then threshold. That's the value nonlinearity, one of the most popular nonlinearities in the deep learning field. So what I've just shown you is that you can derive value from sparsity. What I will show you next is how this generalizes to the case where we don't live in one dimension anymore, but we actually have vectors here and we have matrices for H. Let us look at this in the simplest case first. Let me assume, so this is the optimization problem that I intended to solve in the beginning, right? My sparse coding problem. You give me a guess of the matrix H and you're trying to find the sources. You're trying to find the location and the amplitudes of events. Let me assume that the columns of my matrix H are orthogonal to each other and are normalized to have unit ones. This doesn't make sense for convolutions because convolutions, H consists of delayed versions of each other, right? So you're going to get correlations there, but we're going to treat that case next. Let's think of this case first. It turns out that in this case, because H is an isometry, what you ought to do is the following. This L2 distance y minus hx squared, I can replace with h transpose y minus x squared because H is an isometry. Once I do that, the problem separates into one-dimensional problems of this form here, so that the solution to this optimization problem, when H is an isometry, is obtained by projecting the data y onto H, subtracting by lambda, and taking a value. What does that remind you of? That's the one-layer neural network, where the weights of the network are given by H transpose, the nonlinearity is a value, and the bias of that nonlinearity is given by negative lambda. Okay, so what I've just shown you is that value networks solve sparse coding in two simple cases in one dimension, and in one case when the weights of the matrix involved in the sparse coding problem is an isometry. How does this idea generalize to the case when H is not an isometry? Well, let us make some reasonable assumption. Let us assume that H transpose H has bounded spectral norm. And here I want to give a shout out to Jan LeCun. So what do you do in this case? This is a paper he wrote in 2010 that I believe is not well known, but has become very influential in my field. So the suggestion is the following. When H is not an isometry, what one ought to do is take gradient descent steps on the least squares loss. Let's look at this component here. This is gradient descent on the least squared loss, right? Followed by application of this thresholding idea from the orthogonal case, right? So you end up with an iterative algorithm that does gradient descent, thresholds, and repeats this over and over again. And in a 2010 paper, Jan LeCun and one of his students showed that by unfolding the iterations of that iterative algorithm, you end up with a recurrent neural network for solving sparse coding problems. So you give it the data Y, you tell it the sources. At the output of this network, it identifies the location of the events and their amplitudes. Okay? How does this generalize to non-sparse losses? So this is an example that I cooked up. I don't actually think anybody has published this, but you can do this derivation very simply. Let me change the prior. Instead of being this lambda absolute value, I'm going to change my prior to be this two-sided Gaussian. Right? This looks very interesting, right? So for negative values, I have a Gaussian with some standard deviation, and for positive values, I have a Gaussian with another standard deviation. If you draw the PDF associated with this, it looks like this. It looks like a two-sided Gaussian that is continuous at the origin. Well, the optimization problem in one dimension looks the same as earlier, except that now I've replaced the prior from sparsity to this new interesting looking prior. Turns out that if you go to the math, same math that I did earlier for deriving value, you can derive another popular nonlinearity in the neural networks literature, the leaky value. Later in the talk, I will show you that you can do this for a lot of sets of nonlinearities that lead to different kind of structure for the location and the amplitudes of your events. So to summarize what we've done so far, initially what I was interested in is solving this dictionary learning problem. We broke it into a sparse coding problem. And what I've just shown you is that sparse coding problem, solving it can be done utilizing neural networks that incorporates the weights of the sparse coding problem and nonlinearities that come from the prior that you assume on the hidden representations associated with the sources. Well, we have a way now to obtain the amplitude and the location of events given the sources. Remember, we want to learn also the sources. So now we have to do what's called a dictionary update step. I started with a guess of the sources. I found the sparse vectors or vectors with a prior that you picked that is associated with that guess. Now I want to use these new vectors to now update my sources. This is the step that is typically computationally expensive in dictionary learning. Why? Because it involves now the sum over all of your data. Imagine you had recordings that are very common in neuroscience now that are days long. You have to solve this optimization problem over all of the data set. Now, this problem here, it turns out, is not a difficult one, despite the fact that you may have a massive data set. Why? Because it's just a convex optimization problem. Quadratic loss function, quadratic constraint set. And typically this is computationally expensive, but by utilizing GPUs, again, and stochastic gradient descent, where you would update these weights in a batch by batch fashion, you can leverage the parallelism and the computational gains that GPUs afford. Now I'm going to take the two components that I just showed you, put them together, and it's going to give me an autoencoder architecture for dictionary learning. This is what we will do in the next slide. So what you start with is a nonlinear encoder. You initialize the sources, okay? Given that guess of the sources, you run that sparse coding algorithm forward, which, as I've showed you, is equivalent to doing gradient descent followed by a bunch of values where the weights depend on the source matrix H. When that converges after a large number of iteration capital T, and I can answer questions later about how you pick this capital T, you use these sparse vectors that you've identified to now try and reconstruct the input of the network. If you put those together, you obtain an autoencoded neural network that I will show you in the next slide. If trained by backpropagation, you give it data from the electrodes in my neuroscience example. You ask it to predict those same data. You train it by backprop using the MSE loss. It's going to identify the sources that are present. And these hidden layers here are going to tell you when the sources occur and with what amplitude. And what I claim is that through this example, and I will generalize it in a second for you, to different assumptions about the data and different assumptions about the price, what I claim is that this gives us a prescription to build networks in a principled fashion by baking in assumptions that we may have about the generative processes of the data. If you were present last week at the one of the IAIFI seminars last week that I did with George Barbastatis, this H here doesn't have to be just a matrix. It could be a physical operator, some physics equation, some integral operator that depends on some physical parameters. In that case, your unknown parameters that you're going to learn through backpropagation are not just filters anymore, right? They would be physical parameters that are associated with whatever physical processes you're interested in studying, okay? So we have some theoretical work on this with one of my students showing conditions under which this works and so on and so forth. I'm not going to have time to go through this during this talk, but I want to show you next through simulation that this idea works. So what we did is the following, very simple examples. We simulated 3 sources, each with a known filter, right? We simulated data that looks like this. The sources appear sparsely in time with some amplitudes. We added noise to the data. Given the black trace here, we fed it to the autoencoder architecture and asked it to identify the sources as well as the location and the amplitudes of events. Now, how does that work? It works as follows. Because I picked the filters, let me explain to you what this slide shows. On the x-axis, you have epochs of training your neural networks. The unknown of the neural networks are the 3 filters associated with each of the source. Because I've picked them, I know the ground truth filter, HC. What I'm going to plot for you here is, as a function of training, if this is the ground truth source, as a function of training, I'm going to plot the sine of the angle between my estimates of every iteration of backprop and my original sources. And what you see is that at the end of backprop, you converge to the true sources that generated the data. Okay. What this slide is meant to convey is that this is tremendously faster than anything you could achieve using standard tools from optimization and not utilizing GPUs. So this process of learning the sources, training that autoencoder architectures, it takes us about roughly 5 times as less as methods that are out there to do this using tools from dictionary learning and signal processing. What I'm calling the spike sorting problem, once you've identified the sources, now identifying the location and the amplitude of events, it takes us less than a second to do this by leveraging GPUs, neural networks implemented on GPUs and tailored to the model. It takes about 20 hours for competing models to do this, okay? Now, one thing we've done is the following. We've applied this to data that's actually recorded from the brain. And one interesting thing that neuroscientists can do these days is that in very limited setting, they can actually get ground truth data. You can not only insert a bunch of electrodes that record from neighboring sources, but for 1 or 2 neurons, you can insert electrodes inside them that give you ground truth data. And by applying our technique to those data, we were actually able to show that we're very competitive in our ability to detect true events that are present in the data versus our ability to not have a lot of false alarms, basically. In a paper that we wrote last year in 2010, we showed that this approach generalizes to any data that comes from the exponential family. So suppose now that my data are count valued, Poisson data, or binomial valued, okay? And that underlying those data, you have a bunch of convolutional filters that are generating them, but because of nonlinearities, which you can only observe are counts, for example, right? We showed that you can start with a statistical model of that generative process, and I'll show you this in the next slide. And you can design neural network architectures that are going to involve now a new set of nonlinearities that are meant to account for the fact that your data now are not real valued anymore, such as in the Gaussian case, but that they're count valued. We applied this to Poisson image denoising. So what you observe now are, in this particular example, images that look grainy. Why? Because every pixel now is binary. This is a low photon count image. And what we said is the following. Well, let's treat this Y here as a 2-dimensional image. And let's assume that underlying this Y, there is a rate function. There is a spatial Poisson rate. And the log of the spatial Poisson rate has a convolutional structure to it. Why the log? This has to do with things related to the exponential family, where if I take the log of the rate here, I can now allow hx to take negative and positive values. And then taking an exponential of hx is going to give me my rate back, which is a quantity that is non-negative, right? What did we do? You start with this Poisson assumption on the rate, this log linear convolutional model on the rate, assumption of sparsity. Again, because you have a probabilistic generative model here, I can use the similar idea from dictionary learning to turn this into a principled fashion, into an autoencoder now that takes in these binary valued images. And at the output of it, it produces an estimate of the continuous valued rate that underlies them. The loss function that you utilize comes from the Poisson likelihood here because of our Poisson assumption here. And you see this new nonlinearity here, right? This exponential function, which is the inverse of this log that you use here. One thing I want to point out here that is very important and very interesting is that look at the number of parameters of our architectures. Because the weights are shared across layers, we have orders of magnitude fewer than parameters than state-of-the-art deep neural networks, and we can achieve very competitive performance. This is one of the disadvantages of designing the networks from the perspective of these generative models. One of the things I've been excited about recently, and that I'll show you in the next slide, I've started to think about with some colleagues at IAIFI, the director Jesse Taylor included, is that depending on what kind of prior you pick for the X's, you generate new families of activation functions. So the simplest one is if you had a Gaussian prior on the X's, just quadratic, right? There's no nonlinearity. Everything is linear. So the activation function applies linearly to the hidden layers. The example we saw was sparsity, and the activation function is the value with biases given by the amount of sparsity that you want. I showed you an interesting example earlier, which was a two-sided Gaussian, and that led to a leaky value. A couple of my students recently have figured out that if you now ask for group sparsity, so now you have a prior where you want activations of the hidden layers to be non-zero in blocks, you end up with this new nonlinearity, which the details of are not important, but it's a group form of value, right? And in something I'm going to show you in the next slide, if you want to put simplex constraints on the hidden representations of your network, as well as non-negativity constraint, you end up with another group form of value that implements this. Again, the idea being here that, so in this slide, I changed the prior, it gave me new nonlinearities. In the earlier slide, I changed the likelihood or my data on my assumptions on the distribution of the data. It also gave rise again to new nonlinearities. So in this manner, I'm able to control pretty much every block in this neural network. Now, a comment you might have is that, what if your model is far from the true data generated process? Well, again, this is an approximation. And one of the things we've been working with is, hey, you can untie the weights of the layers. This is going to allow you to capture variations from the actual model and so on and so forth. So there's ways to mitigate questions such as those. So again, last example, before I move on to the second part of the talk that I've been very interested in, we developed recently a method, a dictionary learning-based method for learning piecewise approximations of manifolds. So I give you two examples of very simple manifolds here, a circle and a popular manifold in the clustering community. This is called the two-moon data sets because they look like two inverted moons. So suppose that now my Ys, the unsupervised data that I'm getting, are sampled from these manifolds, right? We've developed a method that produces things such as the figure in the bottom here. It's going to learn these red archetypes, these red anchors that are going to allow you to obtain piecewise linear approximations of the manifolds. How is it going to do this? Dictionary learning again, sparse coding. These are my Ys. I'm going to say that I want to use the archetypes A's, these red dots, to reconstruct points. Very reasonable. Let us look at this constraint first. This is the simplex constraint. It says that any Y can only use a convex combination of columns of A, which is where these lines here come from. And I also want the entries of the vector X here to be non-negative. One of our innovations is this regularization term here, which leads to manifold learning and interesting clustering properties. It says the following: if you're a point Y and you're very far from a column, from an archetype, so let's think of the point that's sitting in the middle of the segment here. I want to disallow it to use this archetype here. How can I do that? I can penalize distance between the points and the different archetypes that I have the data. But cranking the same machine that I just showed you, we have a probabilistic model. We're going to use this idea of alternating minimization and unfolding neural networks to turn this optimization problem, the problem of learning the dictionary, the archetypes, and which convex combination, every example use this, into a neural networks, where every component of the network, after we train it, the weights of the network A are related to these archetypes. When it converges, for every example, the hidden layers are going to tell us which convex combination of the archetypes you want to use to reconstruct your data. And we've begun discussions with Jesse Thaler again and his group into how can we think about this from the perspective of analyzing data from the LHC. And I'm excited to talk more about this. So I want to move on now to the next part of my talk, which is, so what I've talked about so far, right, is, so in a sense, you can think of the sparse coding model. I think of it as a shallow model. Despite the fact that my encoder might be deep because of the unfolding of the sparse coding iterations, I think about it as a shallow model. And the reason is there's only one set of weights. There's no idea in which my Ys here are generated hierarchically. So one thing I've thought a lot about and that I've come up with recently is a generalization of this model to incorporate a hierarchical layers of processing. And I call this the deep sparse coding model. That's what I want to talk about next. So it turns out actually that every time you hear people talk about deep learning, they say that it's motivated by neuroscience. One of the things they don't mention to you is that that motivation from neuroscience actually came from sparse coding. So neuroscientists said something very clever about 20, 25 years ago, which I said at the beginning of the talk. Actually, no, it goes back to the 60s. They said that if the brain evolved to process natural signals, you see a couple of natural images here. If the brain or the visual system of mammals evolved to process signals like this, then the brain must have also evolved internally a generative model for these signals for which it performs inference. The brain must have some model that it utilizes to then process these images in an inference fashion to extract features that it can use to categorize different objects. And those neuroscientists say that, well, if that is the case, I should be able to utilize the natural signals to generate virtual doubles of brain regions, digital doubles of brain regions that I can then do a lot of interesting tweaking and surgery on in a virtual sense to understand the principles of hierarchical processing. So what those neuroscientists did back then was to come up with a shallow version of that sparse coding model that only explained the early layers of visual processing. I came up with a deep version of it, and I'm just showing you a 2-layer version of it. You can make this deeper. And my model says the following. Why is my image here? This is supposed to represent that internal generative model that the brain has. My model says that, hey, the brain is going to start with a very high level concept X. That's a very sparse vector. So imagine this was the image of a dog. This high level concept would just say dog. The model says that then the brain goes through a hierarchy of transformation that refines that. After the first transformation, you could end up with a black dog. After the second transformation, you could end up with a small black dog, until so on and so forth, you end up with a complete description of the particular dog that you're looking at. Now, what's important, what's interesting about this model, and that's what I call it, why I call it deeply sparse. Notice here that the columns of this matrix A1 are sparse, which means that if you start with a sparse concept, you're going to preserve sparsity after the first few layers of processing. That's why I call it deeply sparse. Why would you expect that the brain would evolve such a model? Well, hierarchical classification. Sometimes you just want to be able to tell that it's a dog or a cat, but sometimes you might want to be able to distinguish between different breeds of dogs or different breeds of cats, which means that the level of detail you need to solve that classification task would have to be different, which is why in some sense you would want to evolve these hierarchical representations. And I don't have examples of this here, but this idea of hierarchical representations of increasing complexity abounds in a lot of disciplines in science and engineering. Okay, so this is my generative model. And if it's a reasonable generative model that the brain may use, visual areas in the brain, how can I turn it into a neural network that I can then apply to natural images to give me a sense from the neural network of what principles might underlie hierarchical processing of images by the brain? We're going to play the same game. You give me a data set of images. I have a deep sparse model where I have this assumption that every layer of processing has sparsity until I get to my image here. I can turn this into an autoencoder architecture. Again, where the nonlinearities which are present for this 2-layer model, you have 2 sets of nonlinearities, which comes from assumptions of sparsity of these 2 hidden representations here. The weights of the network are in 1-to-1 correspondence with the weight of my generative model. You would train this using a data set of natural images. You will learn a bunch of weights A2 and A1. And the way we think of A2 and A1 in neuroscience is that you should think of Y as the retina. You should think of the hidden representation that precedes the matrix A2 as neural activity in V1, which is the first layer of visual processing. You should think of X1 here as neural activity in V2, which is the next layer of visual processing, and so on and so forth. Which means that after I've trained my autoencoder, this architecture, I can treat as a virtual double of a brain that processes visual information. So I should be able to tweak it around and look at its properties to kind of get a sense of how the brain processes information hierarchically. I did this in a paper that I published last year. And if you use a data set of natural images, this two-layer model learns these two sets of representations, these two dictionaries. A couple of things are interesting here. The dictionary A2 here, if you can see this clearly enough, it corresponds to oriented lines. It corresponds to filters with different orientation. They're called Gabor-like filters. And this was known since the late 90s, that if you take patches of natural images and you train them, you should see these oriented lines, right? Which kind of respects our intuition that images consist of edges with different orientations and so on and so forth, right? What's interesting is the sparse matrix here that we learn, and particularly the product of their matrices. Because the question you could ask me is the following. You could ask me, well, Demba, this looks like a linear model. Instead of learning these two separate matrices, why don't I just learn their product? You could do that. The interesting thing here is that by learning a decomposition of them, such that one of the matrices in the decomposition is sparse, you end up with a generative model with orders of magnitude fewer parameters than if you had learned the product matrices, right? So what this model does is that it constrained the product matrices to have these sparse constraints. And what's interesting is that after training the model and you take their products, you still end up with oriented lines, which suggests that through this two-layer deep sparse model, what each of the different layers are doing is that they're giving you representations with different levels of complexity. I don't have enough time to give full justice to this paper, but one of the contributions in this theoretical paper was that it kind of gave us, at least it gave me, some guiding principles for architecture design. So here's the question that I asked in that theoretical paper. Suppose you fix a number of layers here, 2 of them, and all but the last have this sparsity structure in their columns, okay? So you have a vector Y here that lives in RD. This could be an image, okay? And it has this hierarchically sparse representation. Under which conditions on these matrices and on these number of dimensions could I provably show that in an unsupervised fashion, I can learn these weights by training a neural network, right? And my paper shows the following. My paper says that you should do the following, that you should first pick the number of hidden units in your first layer. That's R2. That layer can be dense. If you fixed different levels of sparsity for each of the representation, it constrains the sparsity of the set of weights that are going to connect this first layer to the next layer. Excuse me. My article says that you should pick the size of the next layer to be proportional to the size of the preceding layer multiplied by the sparsity of their connectivity. You should see expansion. And you can repeat this process. I'm just showing you 2 layers here. Okay. And my article says that the amount of data that you would need to learn this in an unsupervised fashion is proportional to the dimensionality of the last hidden layer and the sparsity of the representation at that layer. Again, I don't have enough time to do justice to this paper theoretically, and I will wrap up in a minute here. But the idea is that by starting with this theoretical model, it gave me some guiding principles as to how I can design architectures for which you could provably learn their weights in an unsupervised fashion using dictionary learning. And this has some predictions or some implications for how the brain processes information hierarchically. This is a 3-layer generation of that model. Again, sparsity is preserved at every layer of the representation. This is the idea here. My model suggests that, so think of Y again as the retina, first layer of processing. My model suggests that as you go deeper in the brain, the representations should be sparser and sparser. And we have evidence of this in neuroscience. Think of this as you start with an image here, as you go up at the highest levels of cognitive processing in the brain. If this were a dog, there should be a neuron here that says dog, okay? And this is an idea that I says go back to the 60s that was posited by Horace Barlow. So my model relies on this assumption that in neuroscience, we think of these matrices here as synaptic connectivity between regions. my model has this assumption that that synaptic connectivity should be sparse. And one of the things I've been thinking about with neuroscientists is, can we actually test out this model using experiments? Can we verify this model? Can we modify it, and so on and so forth? So to conclude, what I try to give you is, or I try to paint a picture that says that starting from statistical models, we can have very principled prescriptions for how do you design neural network for solving supervised learning problems. In this case, you could generalize what I just did to unsupervised learning problems. You could generalize this to supervised learning problems. The idea being here that prior assumptions in your statistical model, assumptions on your data, directly lead to components of your architectures, the activation functions, the training loss you're going to use, and so on and so forth. One reason why you might want to do this is to leverage GPUs and that technology. And this leads, in my opinion, to architectures that I call interpretable and that have tremendously fewer parameters than a standard neural network. And just overall, again, just quoting that term that my colleague at MIT coined, this was a call for how can we utilize neural networks and AI in science? And I use neuroscience as an example to develop substantive intelligence, right? So make the AI work for us rather than essentially connecting, excuse me for the expression, but connecting a bunch of Legos together and hoping that something interesting happens at the outputs of our network. I think we're in a position, especially in fields such as physics, where we have governing equations and so on and so forth. We're in a position where we can tailor the architectures to the problems that are interesting to us. And that's what I find exciting about IAIFI. And I will finish my talk here. Thank you for your attention.
All right, Demba, thank you for the wonderful colloquium. It was great to hear about your work. There was a bit of a discussion that happened in real time in the chat. Maybe I'll ask Sona if she'd like to ask a question based on that discussion, or if it was sorted out to begin with.
Jim, shall I stop sharing, or?
I might keep sharing just in case people have questions about your slides.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Sounds great.
Oh, yes, that's right. I'm sorry. I need to unmute her.
Hi, thank you so much for the great talk. I think, yeah, early in your slides, so you made this assumption that the H matrix is sort of like tuplets. I have less background on the neuroscience side, so there was a couple of insightful discussion on that, but I wanted to ask you, what is the assumption behind H being tuplets?
Well, so the assumptions behind H being tuplets comes from the convolution operation. So one way to explain this is as follows, right? So here actually, so you have a sensor. You have a sensor that's listening to sources around it, right? Every neuron has its own signature, and you see events from that neurons at different points in time. Right? That's a convolution operation. And it comes from this picture here, where the neuron has a signature. It appears at different points in time. That leads to convolution. And that structure leads to the tuplet structure in the matrix. And one comment I want to make here, H doesn't have to be tuplets. H is whatever assumptions come from what you know about the generative process in your data. In this case, a reasonable generative process is that neural patterns, signatures of neural sources, appear at different points in time and with different amplitudes. Hope that answers your question.
Yes. Maybe can I follow up with another naive question?
Sure.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is just very like sort of a big picture, just trying myself to intuitively understand. So in your formalism, so you started with dense matrix, and then you started like going through some like encoding it in a sparse matrix, so if I understand it correctly. Then in physics, normally when we talk about hierarchy, we sort of talk about renormalization group, which is sort of normally we start with something that maybe looks more like sparse, and then it's starting like getting rid of some of the degrees of freedom which are irrelevant, and find out sort of like coarse graining. So I was just like trying to connect these sort of two ideas. Maybe there is a connection, maybe there is not. And one thing also maybe wasn't completely clear for me that you mentioned that also there is a sign in neuroscience that they see that in general there is this sparsity in the structure. Finally, how we can also characterize the efficiency of that sparsity that are happening,
If
for
it,
example, from an
effic-
image to the final.
efficiency in what sense? Efficiency in what sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in general, if we normally talk about like what is happening in the brain in terms of computation, which is more efficient than what we could have. So
I see.
So it's just like
I'm going to speculate on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I think that, for me it was like very interesting that we start with something dense and then go towards something that is just more sparse. And does that mean that it's more efficient?
So it depends on how you look at it actually, right? So from the perspective, so the brain does inference. So you give the brain an image, it tries to go back to a representation of it. But what I'm suggesting is that what forward model is the brain using to do inference on? So that's where the generative model comes from. And I'm not quite sure how to connect it to this idea that you mentioned from physics. But the way I think about this, right? If that idea is connected at all to wavelets, right? So in the sense that your wavelet, right? It starts from a very coarse representation, which is the representation here. And it makes it progressively more detailed, right? So that's the sense in which I think about wavelet. But now when you think about a wavelet representation of a signal though, right? It starts with the signal and it progressively coarsens this. And that's what I think about the inference step that the brain might be doing, right? Because it's trying to decide, is this a dog or not? It's trying to make a classification, right?
Exactly.
From the efficiency perspective, I'm going to speculate here because I don't think neuroscientists have settled this question. So I'm going to tell you part my opinion and part things that neuroscientists have mentioned, right? So one motivation for sparsity in neuroscience comes from this idea of metabolic resources. It's expensive to fire. There might be a constrained budget. So think of X here as all the neurons in some brain slice. There might be a budget of glucose, ATP, energetic resources over there that region cannot go over. If that is the case, it makes sense that the patterns of firing be constrained in a sparse fashion. That's my intuition for that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
All right, Daniel's next.
Thanks. Thanks for the great talk. I was very interested. I also did some neurology stuff and in epilepsy. So looking at which tissue is epileptogenic, basically, also as a network. And I was basically wondering about causal relations between neurons. Of course, in epilepsy research, it's a bit more coarse-grained, bigger electrodes. But I was wondering, what if one neuron is linked to another neuron in time, temporally? How would that translate in this, for instance, in this age matrix?
So that is very interesting. So the way I think about it is not that it translates in H, it translates into X. I think what you're suggesting is that my prior here on the X's is not an independent prior for the different entries. So again, if we think of every entry of X here as representing a neuron, the prior that I showed in this slide, okay, let me go back to the prior table. Here. So think of this here, the column where it says expression, think of this as a prior on neural activity. So the second one is the one we're typically used to in neuroscience, that's sparsity. It has an independent prior on neural activity simply because you have a sum over all neurons. The way I would translate what you just told me, right, is there would need to be some form of covariance matrix here that I would want to learn from the data that tells me how the neurons are connected to each other. That's how I think about it.
All right, Jesse's next.
Thanks, Demba, for the great presentation. So I wanted to know in this last example of your deep sparse coding, how are kind of, I don't know if I want to call it factorized concepts, how are they treated? So for example, I have cat versus dog, but I kind of have a cat on the left side of the page or the right side of the page. And left and right and cat and dog are in some sense independent concepts that can be kind of taken a product together. How is that represented in your architecture? Or maybe it's not represented in your architecture. Maybe you could speculate if there's a possibility of kind of combining concepts in that way.
It is not represented, Jesse. You bring up an interesting point, right? So I think what your question makes me think of, or again, and these have been considered in sparse coding. This is just a vanilla. A lot of the things that I've talked about here, you can play with the priors, right? So what you just said makes me think of hierarchical sparse coding, where this vector now has a tree structure, right? So you could think of basically different sections of your image as being nodes in a tree, right? And those different nodes have trees of themselves that tells you the different concepts that are there. But I think your question points to something very interesting again, which is how we can bake that into a prior on X. And we can learn that. And we can translate that into the architecture.
Great, thanks.
All right, there was a question from George in the chat. And then we'll take any other questions that are left. He had to leave early. He apologized for that and noted that he loved the leaky ReLU from the double-sided Gaussian story, and I thought that was cool too. The question that he asked is if you replaced y equals hx by something nonlinear so that it's no longer a linear operator, might you expect some novel flavors of ReLU-like functions to emerge?
Yeah, I have to think about that. I have to think about that part for a little bit. I would expect. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I would expect some non-linearities. I mean, basically, as they arise in this Poisson example, right? So in this Poisson example, right, y is not equal to ax. So the rate is related to hx, right? But condition on the rate, there's a Poisson draw that leads to the data, which is where this exponential nonlinearity comes from. So the way I think about this is that if you just give me hx, this could be positive or negative, right? But I need to map that back to a rate. That's where the exponential comes from, right? But I think George might have been hinting at, can I make this more complicated? So one thing people have done is, hey, and this is in the spirit of what I mentioned earlier, which is, let's just use the models as a scaffolding for the architectures, but then let's not be too dogmatic about constraining the architectures in the model. Some people have turned this function here into a neural net. It's a one-dimensional function. Let me just turn that into a neural net with learnable parameters. Some people, Dave Donahoe and some of his collaborators at Stanford, have said, hey, I like this idea of the prior. What if my prior deviates from ReLU? Can I learn more complicated priors? Some people have turned that into a neural net that they actually turn and learn from data.
Excellent, thanks. There's one more question that just came up in the chat, which was how do you determine how many times t to repeat? Do you have some theoretical explanations of how many times to repeat?
So yeah, let me come back here. Yeah, this is interesting. So there's a couple of ways to answer this. The first is if you think of dictionary learning, right? So the classical dictionary learning algorithm says start with a guess, do sparse coding, and then update the dictionary. One thing I want to note here that we found out a few years ago is that this does sparse coding for you. Your classical dictionary learning is equivalent to just backpropping to this decoder instead of backpropping to the full thing. That's number one. Number two is for dictionary learning to work, your sparse coding step needs to be very accurate. And that's where the number of times you have to repeat this becomes important. So in practice, Jim, really you have to make assumptions about H, and you can come up with theoretical results as to how fast given y, you can estimate the x, the true x that might have generated the data. So this gives you rates of convergence of, so let me repeat this. Suppose there was a true vector that generated, sparse vector that generated your data y, okay? And you wanted to estimate that using your encoder here. There's a convergence rate between the different layers of your encoder, the L2 distance, for example, and the true vector that generated it. That can give you some guideline as to how you should pick t. What we found in practice is that, and people had not done this before us, you need to make this very deep. So these encoders we're training, there's 10,000s of iteration layers deep sometimes, right? Because for the sparse coding step to work, when the matrix H has highly correlated columns, you need to run it very deeply. What saves us is that our parameters are not blowing up with the number of layers. We still have the same number of parameters. And in fact, what we found is that for dictionary learning, if you make this 3 layers or 4 layers deep, it's not going to work because your sparse coding step is going to be very poor. And if your sparse coding step, if your encoder doesn't work well, your dictionary learning is going to fail. Now, let me make one last comment, Jim. What you could do is after you've learned the dictionary, and this is what LeCun did in 2010, after you learn the dictionary, you could train a shallow network to approximate the encoder. So that's an interesting twist, right? Because after you've learned the dictionary, you know H, you're happy. LeCun said, let me train a shallow network to learn this mapping from Y to the output of the encoder. And that could be very shallow.
Excellent. Thank you. One question that I had that maybe is the last question, people can feel free to ask another one if they come up, is could you just explain a little bit more about why you might want to do this in this clustering case, this piecewise linear manifold learning? What so you're replacing these what might be a traditional cluster center by like by a sequence of anchors that are connected by these piecewise linear points. Is it to get interpretability of some variety, or just a good approximation, or?
So what do you call the cluster centers in this picture? Just so we're on the same page here.
Well, in this case, I don't. But I mean, I guess that's part of the point, is that there's not a good cluster center in these examples necessarily.
And that's precisely the point, Jim. The point is that I have a nonlinear. So the point is that, oh, okay. Let me make a couple of points. Let's just look at the circle first. So there's no idea of clustering here, right? Here, it's all about approximation or approximation theory. And in fact, I'm working with colleagues from Tufts on this now. How do you think of what a deep network is doing as actually doing a piecewise approximation of a manifold? So this is my data Y sitting on a manifold. What I'm claiming is that these networks that they're basically they're learning piecewise approximation of the manifold. That's one. But two, let's go back to clustering. So in this case, Jim, what we're doing here is the following. We're saying if you can obtain piecewise linear approximations of each of the manifolds, right? Then examples that use the archetypes from, let's say you're sitting on this moon here. You can now define a similarity matrix between examples. All examples sitting on this moon, Jim, are just going to use these archetypes. So they belong to the same cluster. Do you see what I mean? So if you think of the sparse vector as telling you which archetypes you're using, after you learn this, all examples from the same cluster are going to use the same archetypes. And all examples from the second cluster are going to use these other archetypes. And you can cluster linearly in your hidden space.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, I think I understand. I had in mind this 2 half-moon data set where there are these clusters, but I see the point.
Yeah, and to be fair, to give this justice, I would need to give a full talk on this manifold approximation, because it's I think it's an interesting topic of its own. Yeah.
No, it's very nice. I mean, it's still fairly coarse data, this piecewise linear approximation, that nonetheless really gets you good information about the clustering and the 2 half-moon. I mean, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Demba? All right, in that case, let's thank him one more time. Demba, it was a wonderful colloquium. If you could send me your
Thank you very much.
Right after, maybe right when we hang up, that would be great. And the video will be
sounds great.
available on YouTube a few hours later for anyone that was wants to rewatch the talk. Everyone, let's thank Demba one more time. And
thank you. Thank you for your attention and for the invitation.
Wonderful.